American higher education has long doubled as foreign policy. It draws students and scholars from everywhere, seeds relationships that last decades, and feeds the economy and the talent market at home. But that compact is fraying.
Well, it's not a good story, and I think it's going to get even worse.
After years of tougher visas and immigration rules, international enrollment fell by about 15%, putting billions in revenue and tens of thousands of jobs at risk. And it surfaced a hard question. How open should our campuses be in the era of real national security concerns?
Education is our 7th largest export sector for the United States.
We're going to see a decline in the world working on some of the most major problems facing our world.
This is Global Insights by Network 2020. Today, we trace how universities became engines of U.S. influence and what's lost when the world looks elsewhere. Can schools protect research while staying hospitable to top talent?
Academic espionage does happen, but it's probably a much overblown problem.
If students take their ambitions to Canada, the UK, or Australia, what does that mean for America's soft power and its labs and classrooms?
The U.S. hegemony or dominance of higher education and our place in the world is eroding quickly or changing.
And in a crowded, fast-changing global education market, what new approaches could keep the U.S. edge?
It's a dynamic part of our lives. We need to have open access to the talent of the world. That is what has partially fostered our economic development and our being number one really in tech.
Today, we're joined by Dr. Madeline Zavodny and John Douglas. Dr. Zavodny is First Coast Systems Professor of Economics at the University of North Florida and Research Fellow at the Institute of Labor Economics. John Douglas is Senior Research Fellow of Public Policy and Higher Education at the Center for Studies in Higher Education at UC Berkeley. Moderating the conversation is Courtney Dockert, President of Network 2020.
So, to start us off, I'd like to start with you, John. Just talking about the role of higher education's role in foreign policy. So how would you describe the significance of U.S. higher education, both to the United States' domestic strength and to its global influence, particularly as a tool of soft power?
Yeah, to focus a little bit more on the foreign policy side, I think I could kind of couch it in 3 words: people, money, and research. And if you see historically over time, a lot of the focus was on people. So, even the University of California, Berkeley, and its announcement of its becoming established in mid-century 1800s America, part of the language was looking to the markets of Asia. That there was this sense that the universities were, yes, important providers of education and research to some extent domestically, but they also had a foreign kind of look and bringing in students. Berkeley was one of the top institutions in terms of the number of international students by the 1920s. But then you march in, the 30s, we bring in many of the immigrants escaping from Nazi Germany. But the dividing line then comes into money is after World War II. Of course, on the people side, we have the Fulbright program, we have area study programs, the concept that universities need to be engaged in what was the Cold War, and to bring scholars in and know more about the world in a soft power way that I think was largely positive. And then you have the expansion of money. Yes, the Marshall Plan brought funds and things to reconstruct Europe, but you have the U.S. aid is really a beast of the early 60s, and the conceptual ideas that the United States, via its universities partially, was to be engaged in the world in a form of soft power. And how did that, manifest itself? Well, for one, it had to do with doing research in water quality or healthcare or electrification or all these kinds of things in various parts of the world. That was an important expansion of soft power from the United States. And, I think also you could see a very contrast to the Trump administration during the Bush administration, the efforts to halt HIV in Africa and other ways. So we had, and the USAID was a huge program. People talk about the Belt and Road program, but the USAID, in terms of its overall extensive reach and positive aspects it brought to American foreign policy, was really quite significant. Now we're seeing this huge erosion in that, and that's terrible. And I think we'll come back to the issues of what's happening in the United States and what is really kind of a collapse of our science capacity and attacks on universities.
All right, great. Thank you for that overview. Madeline, turning to you, immigration has long played a role in shaping the U.S. economy and society. But how would you assess the broader significance of immigrants to the United States and more specifically their role within U.S. higher education?
Sure. So about 15% or so of the U.S. population is foreign born, or what we would call an immigrant, regardless of legal status, everything from unauthorized to naturalized citizens. About 19% of our labor force is foreign born. So because immigrants do tend to come at working age. Nonetheless, some come younger, right? And so they're part of, our K through 12 population, and in particular, our college and university population. So perhaps 5%, maybe 3 to 5% of undergraduate students in the United States are here on an international student visa. But then there are additional students who were foreign born and came to the United States before starting college. So they'd be immigrants. So maybe 10 to 11% of our undergrad population is an immigrant or foreign born in that way. Among graduate students, it's a much larger number, perhaps 1/6 of graduate students, typically in master's and PhD programs, not in professional programs, are here on an international student visa. And then when you add in immigrants who have other visa status, or perhaps in a few cases are unauthorized, or again, naturalized citizens, even larger, about 25% or so of graduate students are what we would call immigrants. So they're a very large share of students, but not all, unquestionably. And they contribute a lot to our society. Immigrants and international students contribute a lot to our society and our economy. It turns out education is our 7th largest export sector for the United States. Who would have guessed, right? So we make over $43 billion a year from higher education to international students alone. And then again, immigrants are adding as well. And they're not just an important part of higher education, but you could think about the tech sector. You could think about leisure and hospitality. Pick a sector in the United States, from agriculture to, again, high tech, and immigrants are contributing quite a bit to it.
If I could only add one quick thing, which I know Madeline knows, is that there have been studies about the startups in Silicon Valley and how many are from foreign nationals who usually have gone through one of the university sectors of some sort. And I think it's like more than 1/3 of the startups in Silicon Valley have been started up by immigrants. So it's really big. And I just want to point out one other element about is that, like, at a place in the University of California, around 18% of the faculty are foreign born, and some are in path towards citizenship, and some are on H-1B visas. So they really form an important integral part of our institutions and our pipeline towards talent. And I'd only add to the other thing is that there is this question: are foreign-born immigrants coming to our universities displacing domestic students? And the answer is yes. In some circumstances, that probably is the case. But in most cases, it's not happening. Yeah. And particularly in states that have, declining populations or these kinds of issues. And so it's a dynamic part of our lives. We need to have open access to the talent of the world. That is what has partially fosters our economic development and our being number one really in tech.
Right. I think we can all think of, unicorn companies that have been founded or co-founded by immigrants, from Elon Musk to Jensen Zhang and so on, that they're very important to the high-tech sector in particular. About this idea, I've heard this from my own students, that immigrants or international students are taking a slot away from a U.S. native. with the exception of sort of maybe perhaps the very top colleges and universities in the United States, this is not true. There is a lot of capacity, and there's very good research showing that bringing in international students, because they pay full freight and out of state or international tuition, actually are cross-subsidizing in-state domestic students at public universities and also sometimes at private universities as well.
Great. Thank you both for those clarifications. And one brief follow-up, Madeline, do you have any sense, like, are you able to put numbers to the students that come here, let's say, to study and then stay versus those who wind up going back to their home countries?
It is not easy to get to stay in the United States after graduation. It's not that easy necessarily to get an international student visa in the first place. Particularly, the Trump administration this summer made it a lot harder with its interview pause and then a social vetting procedure that they're still exactly trying to figure out. But if you want to stay after graduation, you have the option to do what's called OPT, optional practical training, which is 12 months for most degrees and up to 36 months if you have a STEM major. So that is important of the 3 years, the 36 months, because it basically gives you 3 shots if you were a STEM major from a U.S. college or university at an H-1B visa, which they're numerically capped. They're very hard to get. And so if you're an international student, that's kind of the path you typically would follow if you want to stay in the United States. And of course, not all international students do. Some want to go home because they miss their family and friends, or they've made a commitment to their government or their employer at home. But we do not make it easy to stay. And of course, we've now suddenly made it a whole lot harder and perhaps more expensive, although the details are still unclear about this $100,000 fee and who it applies to.
Great. Thank you for that clarification. Turning back to you, John, Madeline just mentioned some of the Trump administration's policies. Which policies in particular has the Trump administration implemented that directly affect U.S. higher education? And what are, in your mind, some of the broader implications of these policies for universities and America's global standing?
Well, it's not a good story, and I think it's going to get even worse. There are 2 kind of areas in which the Trump administration has attempted to use emergency powers, executive powers that are unprecedented. And one is to make broad cuts in science funding in this fiscal year. One have to understand there's 2 stories going on. I'll tell you the second story shortly, but the first story is the fiscal year of this year. And so there have been broad cuts without clarification as to why, just general statements that, grants from the NSF or NIH have DEI language in it or too woke or something like that. It's the criteria isn't clarified. We're just kind of in this impulsive policy era where nothing needs to be explained or to the public or to universities. And that is being used in combination with attacks on universities for being too DEI, under the charge of allowing anti-Semitism in some systematic way, which is really, I think, very disingenuous. Yes, there have been real issues about anti-Semitism, but the complexity of these conflicts on campuses like UCLA are very hard to unpack. There were, an encampment by pro-Palestinian groups that had both Jewish faculty and students in it, and then a pro-Israel group came and basically started a conflict. At least that's the story that we know. And so there's blame on all sides. But this has been used by the Trump administration to then intervene in institutions such as Harvard, such as Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, and now more recently UCLA, and really the UC system, because this is the first time a public institution has really been put an attack by the Trump administration for supposed civil rights and violations and reverse discrimination charges and these kinds of things that are kind of ongoing. But the way they can really penalize places like Harvard, these are research universities who depend significantly on research funding. A place like Berkeley, or I should say the whole UC system, which is 10 campuses, is around 35% of its entire budget is from the federal government. That's including research funding, but also financial aid that goes to students and these things. So they've used this with this kind of disjuncture between charges of anti-Semitism to then arbitrarily say, "Oh, UCLA, you now have a fine of $1 billion." Trump personally made this claim of a fine that is now ongoing discussions how to do that. So these are two aspects, but then there's all of these different kinds of things that are affecting universities. The visa policies that you've partly talked about, and Madeline has this change in H-1B visas, deportation that's maybe selective, but it's very kind of reminiscent of Russia and Chinese tactics. You go after a few people to lay a message broadly. There's also, fears of censorship. Don't say certain things in your grants or these kinds of things. So, it's really a broad area of areas that are both financially impactful on the ecosystems, particularly of research universities, as I said. And then it demands, if you want that money back for this fiscal year, you need to acquiesce to all kinds of forms of intervention that no federal government has ever attempted before, including monitoring and data on admissions and individuals' names. It's quite worrisome and scary. But as I said, this one last thing is that it's going to get worse. And why is it going to get worse? Well, because we've had court cases in order to reinstate NSF funding. These are, in this fiscal year, these are contractual agreements to do a grant, to perform a grant. You've gone through a process, you have a contractual agreement with the federal government. And there have been lawsuits, some 120 lawsuits, not just on the financial side, but on other issues, including financial aid and civil liberties and these kinds of things. And the court cases have largely, so far, fallen in favor of universities trying to fight back and get, say, NSF money left. But the Supreme Court recently made a decision on a class action suit in which there was around $800 million of NIH money that the lawsuit said, this should be reinstated. You have a contractual agreement with the federal government. And the Supreme Court said, oh, well, I don't know. I think the president has the power to do this. And there may be merits to some of these cases, but you need to go to a lower court and individually claim it. So that really opens the gate of power to Trump in the next fiscal year, where he has already proposed about a 35% cut in funding for science, for R&D in academic milieus. And we'll see if that happens, includes like a 40% cut in the NIH and a 50% cut in the NSF. We'll see if that comes out in this budget fights that come to a head at the end of the month, supposedly. And I think science funding is going to be relegated to a minor issue in light of other major issues such as healthcare for poor people. But the net effect is, even if they do that those cuts are reversed by the Senate and the House in a bill, the Trump administration can say, oh, we're not going to spend the money. And then in addition, final point is they have eroded the peer review process, which has been a cornerstone of American science, and to remove allocation of grant fundings based on scientific merit as determined by the scientific community, as opposed to a political tool. And the Trump has ordered that there should be a political appointee in every funding agency. We have many funding agencies that fund academic research and R&D in general, that this political appointee should review every grant to make sure it follows the president's agenda. So you're creating a scenario in which I think we're going to see a huge financial impact and decimation of the scientific community as we go into the next fiscal year.
Thank you. And one follow-up question to that, just to put this in context. Are these challenges that we're seeing, sort of this tightening of the funding environment and the implications more broadly, are they unique to the United States, or are you seeing similar tensions between immigration, national security, and higher education playing out in other parts of the world?
Well, the most significant match would be Hungary, in which much of some of the tactics that the Trump administration has taken on mirrors those efforts to reorganize science funding, get rid of faculty that are seen as not loyalists. We'll see how far we get into that world, but I'm fearing that we are seeing the scaffolding of kind of a version of autocracy in America. We'll see. I'm not saying it's happened, but we're moving towards the scaffolding of all kinds of areas. Militarize militarize the police, or social media controls. The Kirk tragedy is feeding into an effort to even further suppress freedom of speech and these kinds of things. So Orban is a certain, but I've never seen anywhere these levels of cuts in a structure of science funding that one is, arguably the United States has been the most robust and most successful in the concept of investing in science. And out of the 60s, really came the conceptual idea that you should broadly fund research. You shouldn't be, Soviet-style command economy investing in specific things. That yes, you may have an emphasis on AI or quantum computing, but you're creating a wide and strong effort and geographically strong, and that things burble from that machine that would not come out of a command economy. That's So we're seeing pieces, but nothing to this extent, either increasing funding or decreasing funding. It's just a draconian. It's not well thought out. It's impulsive. It can be justified, maybe, and sometimes they even try a little bit in order to cut the federal spending. But there's no strong sense of a theory or idea. It doesn't match up, for example, with, we're going to increase economic competitiveness of the United States. We're going to increase tech manufacturing, which is the sector that it would have the most promise, not making tennis shoes probably. So it's just a very disjointed and worrisome scenario that we've fallen into.
Yeah, I would add to that basic research that leads to commercial innovations that improve our lives is done mainly at universities, and it's mainly supported by funding from the federal government historically. That there's not the profit motive for private industry to do kind of the basic behind the scenes research that you really need to then lead to the large commercial breakthroughs. And so this is going to have implications for the rest of our lifetimes, honestly, unless it is very quickly and resoundingly reversed. I'm sorry, voice of doom, but this whole conversation is sort of veered in that direction.
Thank you, Madeline. And on the economic implications in general, my understanding is that international student enrollment, as well as I believe domestic student enrollment in the U.S., has been declining in recent years. And please correct me if I'm wrong. But what are some of the broader economic and I suppose social implications as well of this trend, both for universities, but then again, because universities are not isolated, what's the ripple effect in the U.S. economy at large?
Right. So total enrollment by degree-seeking undergraduates has been kind of on a long-term downward trend in the United States. And in some ways, part of this wasn't worrisome because a lot of that decline, as a recent report that came out from the American Enterprise Institute showed, was actually at kind of what we think of as lower tier institutions, perhaps these for-profit diploma mills, maybe, that were getting a lot of scrutiny from the federal government and even being closed in some cases. And so some of that we might not have worried about, but also there's been sort of a broader, I think, cultural shift against higher education, which and higher education, I think, is really important not only as a source of this basic research and so on, but that when you go to college, you're exposed to new ideas, and you don't know what those ideas are until you get there, right? And so I would like to think that what John and I and all of our colleagues in higher education do really is transform lives and teach people to think critically. And, do they end up maybe all using their exact major throughout their careers? Perhaps not. But I think that, everyone who wants to go to college, it'd be great if they were able to, and to have this fantastic educational experience that the U.S. really has been the world leader in providing. Okay, so that's kind of big picture. So enrollment's been kind of on this long-term downward trend. And what we saw during the first Trump administration was a drop in the number of international students. Then the pandemic hit. International students did come back largely under President Biden, particularly at the master's level, as U.S. universities were increasingly turning abroad to help kind of fill their coffers and fill their seats. And international students were very aware that getting a master's degree in a STEM field from a U.S. university was a route into, again, this OPT H-1B path to perhaps stay in the United States for perhaps their entire career, perhaps for a few years, whatever. Then we have the Trump administration come, and this is going to be a very sudden reversal in that's going to then compound what some people call the demographic cliff and what colleges and universities typically call the enrollment cliff, which is that going back 18 years, 2007, the beginning of the Great Recession, was the beginning of a baby bust, a drop in fertility in the United States. So what we saw during the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009 was a drop in birth rates in the United States that has not reversed itself. So when you go 18 years later, the cohort of traditional college-age students begins shrinking. And this is not projected to reverse. So colleges and universities were aware that this cliff was looming. They were turning to international students in increasing numbers who were eager to come to the United States. And so it's this whole confluence of events all at once that bodes very badly for a lot of colleges and universities, except perhaps the top tier, who face other threats, particularly the loss of research funding and all the things that John was talking about.
Got it.
Yeah, I'd only add that there are differences in different parts of the country. The overall trend is, as Madeline said, but there are some states that are growing, or were. We'll see with all of the anti-immigrant policies, which are so detrimental. Generally, we have population, and so I would note, besides the for-profits, we're seeing a lot of small liberal arts colleges going. And, we could argue, of course, it's lovely to have many liberal arts colleges in the Midwest, in other words, but, there's some kind of a shakeout of the market, and higher ed is probably inevitable in some form. And sometimes you find mergers or ways to try to sustain themselves. But, on the big picture is, partly California, for example, now, we're kind of leveling out to some degree, but immigrants have always been a really important part of economic growth. And, not just in going to university and then starting a business in Silicon Valley. We need laborers, we need talented people, but we also need, in the United States, we need other kinds of people that can fit into our economy. So we're really, this anti-immigrant craziness in the midst of population decline in so much of the nation is just not very smart. We have a very complex and emotionally driven debate about immigration, but a logical, remove yourself, you say, well, we need people to go to Ohio to work at this place or whatever, in the restaurants or whatever, and then we need high-tech people. And there's just no careful thinking going on in the Trump administration. And the net result is we're going to have more labor shortages. I think, as Madeline probably well knows, is that, we haven't seen unemployment go up by a lot. Well, that's partly because we're deporting people, or people are removing themselves from the labor market for fear of being deported or victimized in various ways. So we're just not in a logical place in many ways, but immigration policy is one of them.
All right. So today we're focused, of course, on higher education, but where this is going to be felt very hard besides high-tech industries is kind of the lowest tech, agriculture, who was going to pick the crops, meat packing, who was going to do it's called the disassembly line, and then home health care aides. We're an aging country. Who is going to help our elderly? That we have enormous needs across the economy, and we really have an economy that relied on immigrants for our population and labor force growth, and this is suddenly being reversed without a way to fill those needs.
It's a great point, and I feel like we need to have another conversation. I feel like just about that piece. In the meantime, though, I want to get in a couple of more questions, and then I'll turn to the audience for Q&A. So, John, I wanted to talk about one of the reasons why there are some restrictions on international students in U.S. universities, and that has to do with national security risks, particularly in sensitive research fields. So I'm curious to get your take on those concerns, how U.S. universities and policymakers should address them without undermining the benefits of global academic exchange. So what's that right balancing in terms of national security and international students?
Well, I would say in the contemporary context, academic espionage does happen, but it's probably a much overblown problem. Going back to the Obama administration, there were attempts to kind of have universities account for all the joint projects and programs and things they were doing. We had a period of optimism about globalization after around 2000, and there was kind of a sense that universities, for example, should have, a presence in China or Hong Kong or Saudi Arabia even, and or Doha. And there was this optimism, and there was just kind of a not always thought out effort to create international links of various forms, and sometimes not thinking about national security issues. But beginning, about 10 so years ago, the federal government was saying you need to account for what you're doing in federal programs. And this has evolved into, there are areas, in which Chinese students are not allowed to have PhD students in or postdocs and these kinds of things. So they've created areas that are deemed national security risks of some sort. And this is, a structure that now exists. And now the question is, with the Trump administration and then many in the Republican Party, in particular in the House and Senate, who want more restrictive. Like there was another bill out there that said, we should have no Chinese students in the United States based on this kind of blown out idea that they're stealing our secrets and all that. Most students are not working in, vast majority of students don't work in any area that has national security risk. But, there are questions about the technology, and the Xi government is very aggressive about, as they call, sharp power, using ways to, influence politics or infiltrate. So it's an important issue, but it's also not really fully understood, and I think largely overblown.
All right, thank you for that. And Madeline, what steps do you think U.S. universities and policymakers should consider to sustain the country's competitive edge in global higher education, again, while balancing some of these national security concerns?
I'd never heard this phrase "sharp power" before. That's really intriguing and interesting to think about.
Is like, trying to manipulate the election in Australia, which, or student groups going out and monitoring faculty for if they say anything against China, that kind of stuff.
Wow. Right. So we did have this rise in international partnerships where a lot of particularly name brand colleges and universities were setting up foreign campuses or partnering with colleges and universities or foreign governments, perhaps in other countries. And that seems to be going by the wayside, perhaps, but it does seem like a really important way to share your own faculty and students, as well as recruit faculty and students international talent. So it seems important to continue that for our competitive edge. It's just interesting to look at these rankings for what they're worth. I think we all can, roll our eyes perhaps at rankings of colleges and universities, but it's very interesting to, like, if you look a generation ago, international type rankings would be almost exclusively U.S. institutions plus a few British ones, right? Cambridge and Oxford and so on. And now there's Chinese institutions that are in the top 10. And so it is clear that kind of the U.S. hegemony or dominance of higher education and our place in the world is eroding quickly or changing quickly. And cutting funding and cutting off international students is certainly not the answer. I don't know what is, but I think we know what isn't, more than anything else. And so partnering with our international friends, building those friendships with Canada, with the EU, with the UK, with Australia, with Singapore, whatever, seems very important to keeping what had been our traditional role as the place for research and higher education.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned that point about the ranking of universities, because we just had a conversation last week on the race to AI between China and the US. And in that competition for top talent and who's minting that talent as well came up. And so, this conversation and that conversation are actually quite linked in a way. And Brian, if you can just put the link to that discussion in the chat, I think that would be very interesting. So I could keep on talking to both of you for a long time, but unfortunately we are at time. Thank you so much for this discussion. It was a real pleasure to learn from both of you about your extensive knowledge on this issue. So Madeline, John, it was a real pleasure to speak with both of you. And thank you to everyone who listened and for all the great questions. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Bye-bye.
Thank you for joining us on this episode of Global Insights. You can subscribe to Global Insights on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your audio. For more analysis, events, and ways to connect with our community, click on the link in the description. See you next time.